Great. Okay, everyone, thanks for joining us for the afternoon session of today's programming with the MAK. For this second session, we have 3 presentations, and then we will have a discussion afterwards, and we will bring the interlocutors from the first session in as well. So we have Craig Buckley, who's a historian and who's teaching in the art history department at Yale. And Gary Fox, who is an assistant curator in the Department of Architecture at the Getty Research Institute, and Zana Gilbert, who is a senior research specialist at the Getty Research Institute as well. I wanted to kind of take the chance for this second session to briefly introduce the exhibition that's currently happening at the MAK Center's for Art and Architecture's Kings Road House, which is on show until February 4th. And in particular, I wanted to introduce the exhibition as it relates to today's discussion, in which we're bringing together Craig Buckley, Gary Fox, and Zana Gilbert to discuss some case studies related to, let's say, office printing or devices of administration, and the ways that these reprographic technologies were adopted, recuperated, and subverted to open up possibilities for authorial reorganization and decentralization. But to talk a little bit about print-ready drawings, the exhibition at the MAK Center right now, the show set out to explore what it might mean to exhibit a history of architectural authorship, not through singular authors, but through an examination of material supplies. I just realized I need to, there we go. Not through singular authors, but through an examination of the material supplies and techniques of drawing production. And so the drawings that we focused on were those that were not made necessarily to be exhibited, or maybe not valued in quite the same way as some of the drawings maybe we've discussed earlier today, but rather were made for either some form of printing, from the most artful lithographic processes and their separation files or layers, to the mechanical paste-up documents made using commercial techniques for photographic processing, and to the quotidian and bureaucratic working drawings as well. So we hope to foreground the drawing as a site of construction with its own supply chains of materials, manuals for use, and perhaps touch upon some of the embedded asymmetries bound up within these practices, such as the organization, sometimes spatial, of the technical, administrative, and creative acts in the office. So considering, for example, a parallel stream of inquiry into the supplies on the architect's desk, or even to forensically consider, as Julie Riley and Jenny Levitt did, identifying materials of several of the documents in the show as part of their process of making exhibition copies. So we're seeing here a photograph on the left of Julie and Jenny, one of Julie and Jenny's several films within the show, where they made a process of material conservation research and interpretation, usually translating the documents to update the material processes, which in many ways exposes the temporality of novelty and obsolescence in the supplies, intrinsic to the supplies, but also their translations were able to kind of foreground, reoccurring themes around the gender divisions between craft and art, or creative and technical activities, or even distinctions between copying and innovation, this kind of historical terms. So briefly, we looked at sorry, I'm just realizing I have to keep switching here. So we have the architectural covers room, which was looking at 2 parallel projects for designing magazine covers by Lena Bobardi and Roger Catan. In both cases, we can see the kind of cover studies were both privately made in offices by hand prior to their development off-site under technical processes of magazine printing. And so the material and technical aspects of both cover designs were instances of architectural engagement with print media to construct models of authority and authorship. So in the show, you'll see the cover design, for instance, by Catan, who had set up an office in East Harlem in New York to undertake the design of housing and establishing a model of what he called community advocacy planning. But at the same time, he's desiring to embed himself within the community there. In the magazine, you'll see he's using pre-existing languages of flyers and posters, or his engagement with the East Harlem branch of the Young Lords organization. And so starting to look at those organizations and the ways that they already had their pre-existing image-making practices, for instance, a demonstration of diverting public health X-ray trucks to the underserved region of East Harlem to make chest images, for instance, or the ways that the newspaper Parlant was produced from community and volunteer paced-up efforts in order to publish the newspaper. And then very briefly, Worlds on Paper displayed 4 case studies of architectural engagements with visualization of information. Oh, thanks, Gary. Oh, so I didn't tell you guys what I was. Sorry, I'm just going to quickly go back and just point out what I was. So this is the cover study by Roger Catan, where you can see his desired cover and the cover that was actually published. And here we have the Young Lords, their demonstration of diverting the public health chest X-ray unit to East Harlem in order to demonstrate that the region was underserved, but also making images of chest X-rays, right? And then the photo here from Michael Abramson's book on the YLO, showing Richie Perez and Mecca Adai, who were 2 of the people who were working on the layout to Parlant, but there were actually also volunteers that would work on the layouts for the newspaper as well. Okay, so Worlds on Paper discussed 4 case studies of architectural engagement with visualization of information in the post-World War II period. And the documents in this room were exhibited, the documents in this room were designed to change status under the camera eye or through some other form of processing to become an image, whether printed or projected as a film in some cases, maybe self-conscious thinking about lenses and magnification or other forms of technical enhancement that enter the visual language of the work. So we might refer to the office that Herbert Bayer was working in Aspen in Colorado, and the paste up that was, or the mock-up that was made for the World Geographic Atlas, and the ways that there's a sort of secondary processing of existing materials, and the ways that actually the size of the page and the conventions of reusing illustrations, for instance, from printed existing sources like scientific illustrations or from map suppliers, begins to kind of influence the possibilities of conveying an idea of the environmental concepts he was seeking to showcase, including geology and climate. So it's a project of reorganization and sorting. Or Gloria Brown-Simmons' Sun Ra piece from 1968, which was replicated as we weren't able to loan this from the MIT Cavs archive. But Gloria Brown-Simmons, who made this piece while in undergraduate studies at Fisk, and who was thinking about reproducing the idea of the magnification of the sun, but also later herself became, through studying at the digital media department at UCLA under Bill Mitchell, a scientific illustrator, and thinking about the sort of ways that scientific illustration has been deprivileged in forms of other sort of, in the histories of illustration has been deprivileged in some ways in terms of histories of science as well. And very briefly, the Artful Trades was looking at the 1970s and 80s with the proliferation of drawing exhibitions and institutional collecting practices, which we've discussed quite a bit this morning, but thinking about also at the same time, the shifting locus of the printing industry toward computerization and made in office production, which Craig Buckley will talk about possibly, but is very influenced by his book on graphic assemblies, which makes some of the production techniques more viable for architects in the office. And within this room, we were also sort of thinking about a coincidental finding on the back of some of the pieces, for instance, the OMA Exodus print, which, to use a word from this morning, is a sort of unremarkable print, let's say, but on the back there's a stamp from the National Graphical Association, which led to some research into the sort of union activities around the printing industries and graphic industries in the UK, in particular in the 1980s, and the ways that that might suggest that the architects were also involved within that through their graphic practices. And finally, most relevant today is the room where we explored the questions of office printing. The title of that room is Printing Houses, which was as much a reflection on the consideration of where printing happens, whether internally to an office or in a library with a Xerox machine, or outservice to a print shop, or perhaps In the case of Alberto Ponas's heliographic duplicates of the yacht path in Sardinia, there's a sort of latent story behind his regionalist phenomenology of the site and the way he uses his heliograph projects in order to actually sustain the immense growth and demand for luxury villas during his involvement in the development of the resort town. Something like over 100 houses during this kind of particular development of the island. And considering the demand for that and the use of heliostats, and potentially the ways that those produce a sort of alternative phenomenology of the office, centering the printing process rather than a sort of demand side. This is Alberto Ponas's drawings of the yacht pathway, but the way he'll speak about these is as heliographic copies annotated on site in discussion with masons and local surveyors. They're described very much as documentation and working drawings. So there's a whole kind of preservation logic around this. So there's an understanding that drawings are going to be folded and ruined in certain ways that actually touches on other interests that I had around the ways that if you look at I'm going to skip some of these, if you start to look at the kind of manufacturers' messaging around some of these materials, and I just realized, okay. For instance, you might begin to tell a completely alternative history of the engagement of photography and architecture if you start to look at the ways that photographic companies like Kodak or Xerox or DuPont were investing in the production of specific papers and actually drafting techniques like scissor drafting, they called it, in order to produce kind of more and more efficient forms of architectural production. But at the same time, we might also think about the kind of logic of improvisation or duplication that are intertwined within the possibilities of these materials. And finally, this was a discussion earlier today, but this question of storage and miniaturization that comes up potentially around the storage of drawings in other formats and what we are to do with these kind of intermediary documents like negatives that were kind of, let's say, a solution to storing paper. But maybe if we start to think about copying machines that were sold as preservation apparatuses that were described as perpetuating generations of information from page to page, we might thereby render the paper as conceptually fragile, temporary, and unstable. And this might lead us to a paradoxical state where the importance placed on the value of information begins to work against the artistic value of originality. So in other words, if we think about the ink on the printed page becoming seen as of more importance than the paper itself, and the paper becomes unstable and easy to lose or damage. So these are some of the kind of things that we were exploring out of these singular kind of case studies in a way, many other topics, but I think today's the kind of agenda for today with bringing our three presenters together was to delve a little deeper into these questions of reprographics and start to think about the types of workers or authors that were constructed out of these processes and techniques. And hopefully that will also engage with the conversation we began this morning. So we'll start with, we have a running order. We started with Zana Gilbert. Okay. Oh, yeah. Here we go.
Hey everyone. I think I'm probably the only one who's not deeply embedded in the conversations around architecture, but it's actually been really interesting to hear this discussion, because I kind of thought that our research group, which is on women artists and xerography, we were some of the only ones talking about this. So it's been really refreshing to know that there's an audience that and colleagues that are actually working with similar ideas, and it's quite exciting to see. So I wanted to thank the organizers for inviting me. I should say that this project is a collaboration with many people. I'm working with Judith Delphine, who is at the University of Paris, Nanterre, and then great, wonderful number of scholars who are working on very rich, diverse material. And so everything that I'm presenting here is kind of very indebted to all of the conversations I've had with this group. We formed the research project in 2019 that focuses on women in xerography, but we've actually been, I've been working with my colleague John Tain before that on a broader project that was just on Xerox in art. And we, over time, Judith and I got talking about the fact that there was just so many women involved in the sort of pioneering moment of using Xerox, and we kind of developed a project that would focus more because it's a huge field, and now we're actually preparing a manuscript for publication. So soon enough there will be a book, which is exciting. So I'm going to start talking specifically about the US, but I think in line with the conversation from this morning, I will also have something to say about outside the US. But there was a huge amount of activity from women artists in the US, and very much, but not only responding to the very gendered way in which Xerox was marketed. And so, as you can see here, the marketing in the 60s, the Xerox 914 came out in 1959, and there was a sort of bombardment of the public that coalesced with this kind of, the sexist moment where it was like post World War II, and there were many more women in the industries, but mostly working in what was called pink collar labor. And most of the ads focus on the simplicity of operating the machine. And actually, I'm only showing these, secretary narratives, but there was also one with a child. You've probably seen this. And so, there's very obvious implications that, didn't require any level of intelligence, and it's pretty straightforward, but very, it really kind of conditioned the imaginary of the machine. And so there was this kind of cultural imaginary that was produced was then actively resisted by incredible legion of women artists who became interested in foregrounding an alternative imaginary of the female body, and also making visible and present this usually invisible body that performs that labor. And so there's quite a lot of work been done on this. I want to mention Kaylee Perloff, Michelle Donnelly, Jessica Howe, and Tamara Trud have all looked at different examples of artists who very actively kind of resisted that cultural imaginary. And again, it sort of refers back to this question of the copyist and this idea of innovation in terms of the way in which these women artists were intervening in the technology. It was very much a kind of intervention in the processes of the technology, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about the artist Sonia Landy Sheridan. And then probably some of you will be familiar, oh sorry, wrong machine, there we go, with this image. Xerography was in fact invented by a male office worker who was seeking to lighten his load and his office duties, who was Chester Carlson. And the invention happened in 1938, but it took a good 20 years to really develop the technology for the mass market. And the technology was visual from the start. You can see this is the first print that was made. It marks the time, the date and the place that the print was done. but you can see that it's already visual, it kind of looks like a work of conceptual art. And so, yes, it was invented to reproduce documents, but very, very early on and in the initial kind of marketing materials for the 914, they imagined that it would be used for image transfer, so on textiles and ceramics and things like that. So I think the complexity in relationship to art making didn't really come, later with the artist, but was kind of always there. It was always a kind of image making device, and we've been very interested in the ways that the technology is genre defying. So, we're crossing between artists who are very interested in Xerox as a camera kind of device, to a print making device, to a time-based medium in which you could perform and record that performance. And so because it kind of crosses those different genres, it sort of produces interesting questions about them. So we found that artists have often, even though reproduction is one of the most recognizable, qualities and things associated with xerography, they're mostly often using it to create unique and irreproducible prints. So we've been very interested in that, but of course there was also a huge movement in terms of use for zines and mail art. So we've been, we've been very interested in questions of the relationship between the artist and the machine, questions of access in different contexts, which is something I'll come on to a little bit later. But there was an artist called Uji Nilsson Jr. In Brazil, in Sao Paulo, who became a Xerox technician in order to run an experimental Xerox program inside the museum for a couple of years. And so this kind of intertwining of the technical knowledge and the artistic practice became very very close in that way. And Brazil was incidentally the second country to have like a very broad access to Xerox. We found that the artists have used, there have been like community copy shops, these kind of workshops, artists who are able to get a grant or have the means to rent and borrow a photocopier, and others who are just using regular copy shops. And that really affects the ways in which they make their work, obviously, because someone like Barbara T. Smith had her Xerox 914 in her home, in her dining room for 9 months, and was able to do all of this incredibly, intimate and personal work. Nalini Malani, who's another artist that's part of the project from India, she was walking every day to take her materials to give them to somebody to copy, and so did not, probably wouldn't have done anyway, but it did not have the opportunity. So the access and the conditions in which you're using the technology are just incredibly important for the kinds of work, whether you're making them in community or in private. So these are some of the artists that I'm not going to talk about, but I just wanted to show you kind of different images and approaches that have been coming up through the research project. We've been very interested in like questions of haptic photography, how artists use the technology to reflect on notions of memory and archives, and so using like the faded qualities to suggest those kind of fleeting impressions, those kind of things, like ways of creating new images towards kind of creating a new aesthetic that then can do something different. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about Sonia Landis-Sheridan. I don't know if people are already familiar with her at all, but and then I'm going to move on to talk very briefly about Ruth Wolf Rehfeldt, who was an East German artist. So Sonia Landis-Sheridan was in Chicago, and Ruth Wolf Rehfeldt was in East Berlin. Sheridan founded the Generative Systems Program in 1969. Oh, sorry. No, it's okay. I think I can. I think I can handle it. But you can remind me if I forget again. I'm so used to doing it all on one computer. So the program, so this was at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, or SAIC. The program functioned as a kind of collaborative workshop, and she worked with her students, but also she developed relationships with scientists at the 3M Corporation, who offered their expertise. They worked with her on supplying machines, materials, and she did 2 artist residencies. They provided her with thermofax and a 3M color-in-color copy machine. She is always seen wearing her white lab coat, which I think is an interesting kind of inversion of the pink collar work, and she's sort of performing the part of the technician or the scientist. I think, thinking about all of this as performances could be quite productive. But it has to be acknowledged as well that the toner, was pretty messy at times, and she was getting into the machine. So there was a functional role for wearing the coat. Sheridan and the other artists' work that I showed you before were interested in shifting the kinds of images of women that were being made, but also bringing their labor back into the frame, and also producing these kind of time-based images. So producing very different kinds of images to the ones that were circulating in the mainstream media. And sort of responding to these corporate machines in this very intimate and kind of haptic way, somatic way. The Generative Systems Program introduced students into a variety of different techniques. I mentioned the thermofax. There's also the telecopier, the haloid Xerox camera, which was an earlier version of with like many different, I think there were like 67 different processors. And Michelle Donnelly's done a lot of work on how Joan Lyons used that technology and really intervened in the different stages as she was making her self-portraits and portrait work. They use these technologies alongside video monitors and frequency generators and biofeedback systems to intervene in the technology. So they were really not just reproducing images, but kind of intervening in the sort of logic of the machine by introducing, other sorts of feedback into them. There's another image that I have from, this is from our file at the Getty Research Institute, and it's from a series that Sheridan made of flowers. So really taking advantage of this very shallow depths of field and very saturated color. The color machine was a thermal process, which leads to having these very saturated colors. But again, it's like, providing the machine with the kind of images and getting the kind of images from the machine that it's not really designed to produce. And that's over my shoulder, looking at the file, but gives you an impression. Another copied work. What I like about that, these two works together in the archival file, is that one of them is about getting these incredibly detailed images and incredibly beautiful images. And the one underneath, which is a letter that the letter from Jean Brown, who's the collector that she sent this material to. She has photocopied it and then written a note on the letter. Is it working? But it's very difficult to read. So there are these different questions of legibility and illegibility. So you have the kind of incredible detail of one, and then very, very kind of blurred and illegible other. And she's kind of exploring those questions. So just to move on, I wanted to bring in another artist who was living in East Germany, and I wanted to kind of bring this around to the questions of context and access, because in East Germany there was very little access to photocopying technology, and in 1989, after the fall of the wall, Ruth Wolf-Rehfeldt went to one of the newly available copy shops, and she took one of her typewritings, which you see on the left, so the black and white typewriter composition, into one of these new copy shops, and she asked them to photocopy them. And so when I was in her archive several years ago, I asked if she'd ever done anything with Xerox and if there was any access to it at all. And she produced these boxes and opened the boxes, and they were just these pristine stacks of hundreds of photocopies, boxes and boxes of them that had not been opened, I think, since she made the copies. And each of them was on a different brightly colored paper. And there was this sort of very, I got very interested in this act because it was this pure, just the pleasure of reproduction. And her works on the typewriter are incredibly laborious, they are so painstaking. I'm very interested in them as timepieces in which she's recording her labor, because in the 70s, in order to be acknowledged as an artist, you had to, in East Germany, you would need to be a member of the State Association of Artists. If you were a member of the State Association of Artists, you could have access to reproductive technologies, and you would be allowed to print a certain number of works. But it was mostly kind of artist reproduction. So the one on the left, the information, which is called Information, which I also think is interesting, is it's actually an homage to Claude Shannon, and it was reproduced by zincography, which is a form of lithography. And so she was able to reproduce her work, and she also she would reproduce, maybe 200, and she would send them to her contacts in the mail art network. But she wasn't able to become a member of the State Association of Artists until later in the 70s. So she always had to find ways, her husband was a member, so she'd try and get him to reproduce for her. And seeing this access, the new access to photocopier, kind of in the light of the struggles to, to produce her work, to record her labor as an artist, to show that she was actually spending her time as an artist, almost like she's making a case for being an artist. And then something that I've always sort of been interested and struggled with about her work is that she says that when the wall fell, she stopped making work. So she stopped interacting with her contacts in the International Mail Art Network. She did go and make these copies after the fall of the wall, but I have always found very interesting that she sees her creative production because of the fall of the wall. And I think thinking about the sort of ease of reproduction as one way, something that, you know, I've always wondered about, and not being quite able to kind of understand why she would stop producing her work, but thinking about you know, this kind of new access to technology and the immediacy with which it could be produced kind of gave me a clue. But I think I also just enjoy the you know, this idea of, you know, the pure pleasure of reproduction in these works. So that was more or less what I wanted to share with you. I think that there's a little bit more to be said about kind of labor conditions in the GDR, but if we wanted to talk about that in discussion, that would be fine. But yeah, I think I will leave it there. Thank you. My chair. Right.
Two-handed presentation.
I know, it's so confusing.
Do we have people online as well?
Oh, me too. Okay.
I don't need to start the video or?
No,
Okay.
you start whenever.
Okay, all right, and there's a camera I should look at or no, I'm just,
No camera.
no camera, okay. Great.
Yeah, stop them later.
Almost back. Where's the audience? Ready to go?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So thanks, first of all, for the invitation to come here. Thank you, Sarah, for such a wonderful show, and Gia and Maeve for the hospitality. It really is just like a nice opportunity to return to topics that I engaged in my first book, Graphic Assembly, which is really about sort of extraordinary visual production of experimental architecture during the 1960s. And I was really specifically interested there in the way in which techniques like collage and montage became a format for intellectual exchanges across a really broad range of contexts, from London to Tokyo and from Paris to Vienna. It became a kind of lingua franca of communication between the groups during this time period. And the more I started studying these collages and montages as material objects in collections, in basements, in offices, wherever I was finding them, the more I came to be interested in the substrates that they were on, the kinds of materials, the really humble cardboard, paper, or polyester that they were constructed on. And this got me thinking about collage not as a symbolic form, as something that could be extracted from its material context, but that the materiality was really an index of the mode of production of a period. And that this was an era in which so many of these works were being created for reproduction on new small-scale reprographic machines that were becoming available at copy shops in the 1950s and 60s, like the one you see here, which is probably somewhere here in Los Angeles. Maybe someone recognizes it, I'm not sure. On the left, you see the kinds of compact offset lithographic presses that these things would have been run off on, which was, you know, coeval with the Xerox machines, which we saw actually often more accessible than Xerox at that time, which was still a pretty restricted, very expensive office technology at the time. So looking at the exhibition description online, I got it kind of rekindled a curiosity to go back to one piece of this sort of extinct technical constellation, which is self-adhesive transfer media. This was the sort of world of paste-up graphics during this time period, and one piece of that was a material called Zipatone. Of course, there were many brand names for this self-adhesive transfer. There was Zipatone, Chart Pack, Letraset, a whole bunch. They're often referred to in architectural offices as applique or sometimes sticky back. These began as sheets of patterns of dots, as you can see here, but also lines and various textures, and eventually came to include a whole range of alphabets as well as ready-made architectural elements such as walls, doors, tables, beds, toilets, cars, trees, you name it. And these were typically on thin sheets of plastic. There was a little example in the exhibition, which was wonderful to see, that would be rubbed into place using the pressure of a stylus. And the aim was really to save architects and graphic designers the labor of repetitive and time-consuming tasks that were largely standard, such as hatching, stippling, or shading, or else the repetition of conventional drawing details that might have been, let's say, repeated several times in a given drawing. And I wanted to return to this both because of my own curiosity, but also, and this came up this morning, the fact that histories of drawing have been so fixated on things like pencils and pens, rather than these other transfer media, which are actually doing a huge amount of work in architectural history. And the people who have explored this, not surprisingly, are not typically historians or even curators, with the exception of a present company perhaps, but conservators like Alan Smith at the Noy Institute in Rotterdam, or Marion Saint-Cabre at the Pompidou, who have a lot of drawings that have this material in it. It's a total nightmare to try and conserve this stuff. So they've done some of the real interesting groundwork in terms of thinking about its histories. My interest is both in the material, but even more so about the things that the materials were connected to. The turn towards camera-ready production in the graphic arts is one, but also changing ideas about what drawing should do, how drawing should circulate, and about drawing, architectural drawing as work. I think all of that is bound up with this humble material Zipatone, which, or transfer films, which have kind of exited from our awareness. As I'm a historian, I'm also interested in, what kind of stories, what kind of narratives are going to be told, or can we tell, if we put the material operations rather than, say, the architect, the movement, or the period style at the center of the conversation. And broadly, are we looking at this material to try and get at evidence of human imagination and creativity? Or are we looking for techniques and systems and processes that have connected drawings to automation, to repetition, to mechanical reproduction? The answer is that we're looking at both of those things, I think. But the very fact that we can think about both of those avenues when we're looking at material like Zipatone shows that this material was not just material, it's really at the center of contradictions facing architectural design, tensions and contradictions facing architectural design between mind and media, culture, technology, imagination, and automation. And so the following is just an effort to try and piece together some of those thoughts with some examples from work that I've done, but also stuff that I've been able to just sort of locate recently. It's a very much work in progress. So looking forward to any comments. I'll start just by looking at some material from the 1960s that is probably very well known. This is a collage from the magazine Archigram by Ron Heron and Warren Schock. Famous because it sparked what came to be called the Zoom wave, but we also see transfer media playing a kind of important role here. You can see that in addition to the newspaper clippings and the photographs and the drawings, they're using transfer lettering for to place words on the page, to connect things like petroleum cracking towers, rockets, the atomium, superheroes, with words like science, with words like research, with words like engineering. So to kind of produce an ideological effect that's going to connect these images to positive connotations, connotations associated with science and research. If we look at another famous drawing by Cedric Price for his pottery think belt project, you can see that the entire drawing, pretty much, with the exception of a little bit of line work, is all done using transfer media, using those films, colored films that you can see in the frame of the train cabin there that we're looking out of, the very zones of the platform, the sky, the windscreen, all of those are defined with transfer media. In other words, he's evoking with this very light material the kind of lightness of the Potteries Think Belt project itself. The fact that it was repurposing the outmoded infrastructure of rail lines in the potteries and converting them into mobile classrooms and mobile residence units for the students. So kind of evocation of the project's interest in mobility in the very lightness of the drawing materials themselves. Or a drawing like this one from the office of Bertrand Goldberg, from the Art Institute, from Irene's collection, which we saw, to go back to this morning. Here you see, again, those transfer films being used to denote program in a plan form, to easily communicate to a client the various programmatic elements using ready-made cutout films. Or we could look at this drawing, equally well known by Andrea Bronzi, from the MoMA collection, with Archizoom's canonical No-Stop City project, a project which we may think of as a drawing, but it really is entirely composed from transfer films. This is the emblematic image of a manifesto that declared that the factory and the supermarket had become the two dominant models defining the future of the city. And the residential parking project really conceived of an entirely interior realm that was defined by the tension between the regular column grid and zones of vegetation that are denoted with the patterned transfer film there, all of which is articulated by a kind of freely disposed arrangement of partitions, lifts, and bathroom units. When we zoom in, we really see that this is a drawing, but it's entirely composed from cutting and gluing. So it may not look like a collage, but in fact, in some technical sense, it really is. And it's a collage constituted from transfer films. The transfer films that are, in fact, producing the tension between the different elements of the program, between the vegetation, let's say, and the other line work between tone and line. And I think this is key because we have here a really standardized medium, transfer film, being used conceptually to comment on the very process of standardization itself. A kind of ironic subversion of the standardized and anonymous principles that were in fact being used in supermarket and factory planning. So there's a really rich, I'd say, medial self-awareness in drawings like these. And while we may often think about Zipatone as being, key to these 1960s drawings associated with them, I think it's important to remember that the material was in fact in use way before the 1960s. It actually emerges in the 1930s. It was patented in the 20s, and it came to broad use in an era when mass comic strips were being popularized in the public press, of the kind that you see here on the left. And Zipatone was, in fact, emulating a shading medium that was known as Ben-Day dots. And Ben-Day dots came in these sheets of printing film. The idea was really that it would take that kind of dot screen and put it to a new use. So Ben-Day dots were, in fact, patented even earlier. They go back to the 1880s, the era when mass printing really begins to take off. So there's a really long history that connects these patterns of dots back in time, which I think is interesting to think about. Ben-Day dots were originally gelatin sheets that were inked and then carefully applied to printing plates in order to create gridded dot patterns that, when they were reduced, would read as tone in comics of the kind that you saw in the previous image. You would take the Ben-Day screen out, you would ink a screen, and then you would transfer that ink to a metal plate, and then that metal plate would then be etched for reproduction in the newspaper. It was an extraordinarily labor-intensive process. Like one comic strip would need like 10 Ben-Day artists to transfer drawings into a single strip. But what's really important here, I think, is the fact that with the emergence of these Ben-Day screens, we see that the dot or the line no longer represent an individual mark made by a tool, but the syntax of an invisible screen. So that when you're looking at a comic, your perception of differences of color and tone are in fact the effect of a screen, but a screen that you don't see, a regular pattern that operates at the threshold of perception. And you can see that when you enlarge the comics here, you can see the texture of those dots and the way in which they're applied and the way in which they produce visual optical effects, but only when you get close to them. And that's the effect of the Ben-Day screen. It's the effect that the Zipatone screen also tried to reproduce. And it was of course, quite obviously the thing that fascinated pop artists in the 1960s. Any range of artists like Lichtenstein or Warhol, Polka, Kusama began to take up those dots as part of their work in the same period of the 1960s. So what's different is that the Zipatone process, which emerges in the 1930s, takes that Ben-Day pattern, takes aspects of the Ben-Day dot screen, and instead of applying it to the printing plate, they apply it to the drawing. They apply it to paper, to cardstock, to polyester. And of course, it's a very fine and subtle distinction, but I think it's an important one because it marks the shift. It marks the way in which, like, what we might take to be two identical visual structures actually marks a huge shift technologically in the history of printing. A transformation towards camera-ready artwork around World War II, a shift from letterpress relief printing or planar lithographic printing to offset lithographic processes that begin to dominate in the post-war period. Processes where plates are going to be made from photographic negatives that are captured using process cameras. And this is what's going to open up mass printing to a whole range of new actors. It's really interesting that the shift in pattern of dots really begins to index that. A bigger technological transformation, in other words, is at work with Zipatone materials. Zipatone was not only used, and this is something I discovered just recently, it was not only used for things like comics or for graphic arts, it was actually used in map making. And this goes back, it made me think of Irene's talk this morning and the attention to the sort of syntax of mapping. The US Army Corps Map Service Catalog, this one's from 1948, reveals that Zipatone and other films were being actively used in map making technologies in the 1940s. So in addition to the kind of a repertoire of dots, lines, and other patterns, the US Army came up with stick-pat, its own variety of Zipatone, to denote different kinds of soil and vegetation, from mangroves to rice paddies, to palm forests, to sand, to tidal flats, all a kind of like pattern grammar of different types of ecologies. Sort of spookily looks forward to US foreign policy interventions around the world in the second half of the 20th century. And what is really kind of mind-blowing is that that pattern that is used in Archizium's drawing actually matches exactly the tidal flats pattern from the US Army 1948 catalog. So there's some complex transformation going on where a military sort of shading technology eventually becomes part of a more civilian apparatus in the post-war period. And it's just kind of an unresolved question of what to do with that. What does that make us? How do we think about that transfer is something I don't have an answer to exactly right now, but it's a really, I think, interesting question that gets posed by the material itself. So the cartographic use of these kinds of patterns of dot and line tone patterns to distinguish areas would be taken up after World War II, but it doesn't begin there. Again, I think the technical histories go back further. This urban mapping project from 1933 for the very famous fourth CIAM conference devoted to the functionalist city in 1933 had already developed a really sophisticated repertoire of dotting patterns. This pattern language of dots, dashes, lines, hatches, and symbols was used to make different cities comparable and legible against each other. This is the Los Angeles map from 1933. I think it was prepared by Neutra's office. It was one of 230 panels that were exhibited in Athens at the time. And you can see how dots, lines, and other symbols are used to break up the city into different zones. So both the CIM maps and other military maps, dot patterns were not only a tonal media for differentiating areas, that's the way they're used in comic strips, but I think they're also a medium for enabling the combination of different kinds of information. Planar cartographic information could be overlaid with statistical and programmatic information about density, about vegetation, about land usage, as well as social characteristics like race and class. So we see the dot doing a different kind of work here. It's overlaying information, statistical information onto cartographical information. And despite the kind of impersonal appearance of these, in fact, in 1933, these are all being made by hand. So those dots are being made by draftspeople in the offices. And you can see why in the 1940s, Zipatone would take off as a mapping technology to replace that kind of intense and manual work. In the 1950s, we begin to see Zipatone move from comics and mapping into architectural drawing in some interesting ways. Architectural journals begin to use Zipatone in their preparation. These are some of Gordon Cullen's drawings, well known for his townscape drawings in the Architectural Review, and he developed adding Zipatone to the back of sketches that he would make on site on either on semi-transparent trace or vellum. He would get back to the office and he would glue bits of Zipatone onto the back of the drawing in order to create different kinds of shading. And here, I think the regularity of those dot patterns really throws into relief the kind of lyrical quality of his line, the emphasis that he's really that he's doing these sketches on site by hand, which is key to the kind of townscape visual style that he developed. But that's not the only way that Zipatone is in fact being used. If we look at Jim Sterling's drawings from the early 1950s, you can see it there in the shading at the bottom and in the recesses. He's also somebody that often gets credited with introducing Zipatone to architectural drawing. And you can see that here it's exploited for its really impersonal mechanical qualities and to actually make the hand drawing appear more mechanical than in fact it was. And here it's not only to introduce shading, but to introduce ideas about material surface. Banham wrote about this, and he credits Sterling with turning away from what he called the craft professionalism of watercolor rendering, which is really prominent in 1950s architectural culture. And this turn to Zipatone was an effort to fly in the face of that. The skill required by Zipatone was a deftness in manipulating a finicky plastic screen with a knife. It was not the skill of the architect's hand. So it was really a material that was designed to be concealing rather than revealing. It was designed to hide the architect's personality. So again, I think Zipatone might be thought about in terms of a screen that conceals the architect's personality, and in some ways is analogous to the way in which Sterling used ready-made surface materials in his building, like patent glazing or the standard red tiling in something like the Leicester Engineering Building, where we see a kind of use of ready-made standard off-the-shelf materials as being the exterior skin of the building at the moment of high brutalist expressionism with the kind of designed concrete surfaces. It's a subtle material shift, but I think it's also a sea change in sensibility. The architect here is not somebody who invents or creates form or leaves their signature in a sense, but someone who selects and assembles in ways that can be somewhat retreating, that can point to materials that are standard rather than materials that are bespoke. The architect as assembler really hides behind this Zipatone screen. It turns up in another intriguing place, again, in the 1950s, in the work of Le Corbusier, someone who we might not think of as associated with Zipatone. His modular treatise of 1955 includes several collages made from what he called at the time a new product. So it was obviously somewhat new in the 1950s to architects. Zipatone sheets with line and dot patterns fascinated Le Corbusier not for their labor-saving potential. He wasn't interested in reducing the work of the draftspeople in his office, but he was really fascinated by the optical effects that Zipatone patterns would create. And in these pages, if you know them, he asks the reader to play a game with Zipatone. You take two patterns and you sort of rotate them on top of each other, and you can see these geometries appear and then disappear just by the interference between the two patterns. And he was very fascinated with, in fact, the way in which mechanically standardized patterns could create unpredictable effects with the kind of fragility, I'd say, of a kind of geometric order that would appear and then disappear if it were handled incorrectly. I think what's remarkable there is that Le Corbusier is actually recognizing Zipatone as a screen. He's recognizing it as something that is not only for defining an area in shading, but something that's going to produce kinetic optical effects, an ephemeral and unstable experience that is not reducible, in fact, to the standardized pattern that we would think these are. So if we think about this, these anonymous standardized patterns that are mobilized in the architectural drawings in the 1960s are not new inventions. In fact, they inherit a really rich and strange conversation that goes back almost a century, actually. If we go back to the invention of Ben-Day dots, it runs from comic strips and Sunday papers to wartime mapping conventions to the impersonal self-concealing drawings, but also to the first stirrings of op art and the interest in optical patterns as construction media, let's say. These zip drawings developed by experimental architects during the 1970s are typically seen as the opposite end of the spectrum from large, complex, technical construction drawings that are being developed by bureaucratic offices during these years. Yet, again, a material like Zipatone would enable us to think differently about that, to recognize that these drawings, which we might take to be experimental or radical, are actually a response constructed from the same material ecology that large bureaucratic offices are using, and that they were mobilized in practices that were codified as systems drafting or overlay drafting during these years, all of which were promoted to make drawing more efficient and to reduce labor costs in offices. And this depended on, of course, introducing symbols like these as ready-made elements that could be used in drawings in order to avoid the repetition of various details. Instead, you apply them in multiple places. They also depend on the use of mylar films during these years. Companies like DuPont and whatnot are introducing this and codifying some of the technologies for these overlay processes, where we see the use of these multiple mylar films and the infrastructure of the pin bar to keep those drawings registered, and also to create an ecology that's operating through layers, where each of these, the way that overlay drafting worked was that you would have a base layer that would correspond to usually the structural base structural scheme, and then you would overlay details on ventilation, partitions, ceiling plans, electrical information, so that you could change any of those elements without having to redo the drawing. So we see a new kind of layered material ecology emerging that I think is both happening in the large offices and in the experimental offices at the same time. So Zipatone, I think, confuses some of those familiar distinctions from the period. And in doing so, I think they help us think about the sort of screen quality that drawings are assuming during this period, or that have maybe lurked within drawings for quite a long time. So long before, I guess, the digital revolution of the 1980s, there is a new kind of layered interface that we are seeing in drawing, connected to materials like Zipatone, that is worth thinking about. It would suggest that the digital was not a rupture, but was in fact a stratified phenomenon, something in which layers from analog media survive and structure the operations of later programs, not unlike the layering of drawing itself. So I'll conclude with a question, and I wonder if the concept of print-ready drawing that's put forward in this exhibition might be understood as something like screen-ready drawing. In fact, that we have a drawing that's increasingly being readied for the screen, but also that we might think of the screen not only as a display system for showing images, but as part of the whole apparatus of transfer that media require in order to operate. That is to say, screening is not only something that allows something to appear, it's also the infrastructure that allows images to move in different ways and to be registered in different locations, to be connected to different kinds of labor. From the emergence of transfer media like Zipatone in the 1930s, to the mapping of the 40s, to the incorporation of Zipatone into drafting in the 50s, to the 60s experimental drawings and the overlay drafting of the 1970s, there's a process in which drawing is increasingly in conversation with screen media. And over the course of its development, I think the process of converting materials assembled on a surface for print progressively eliminates an entire realm of manual work that was once used for moving drawings from one surface to another. And it's the screens, whether it be the Ben-Day screen or the Zipatone screen or the screens of Mylar, which in fact take over that work. And allow for this image transfer to be more and more captured through optical media. So if that lesson holds water, then I think drawing's absorption into the screen is not something that comes after the age of paper. It's in fact already deeply within the age of paper. It's been there for a very long time. And just now are we able to recognize it. So that's it. Thank you.
That's better. Great. And then yeah, the audio is through Brian's computer.
Hi, everyone. Figured better as a talking head rather than a disembodied voice, so here I am. Very happy to have this opportunity to test out some research I've been developing as part of the larger Paul R. Williams research project at the Getty Research Institute. What I'll present today is a somewhat formalized narrative, but hopefully not unwelcomely so. And I should just say from the outset that this work I'm developing here represents just one part of a larger collaborative effort developed alongside a number of people whose labor I think it is important to make explicit: Aaron Brooks, Maristela Cachato, Ann Harrison, Sarah McGillivray, Anna Casasena at the GRI, Milton Curry, Amy Murphy, Valerie Augustine at USC, and Stacy Steinberger and Naima Keith at LACMA. Whether by chance or by design, or more likely some combination of the two, the archive of architect Paul R. Williams is in very large part composed exclusively of working drawings, construction documents, specification, and the like. Some are photomechanical, but distinct to some of the cases we were considering earlier, many were produced by hand. Still, these were multiple, reproducible, and in fact reproduced with a continuity of technique or practice in this effort to copy, raising insistent questions of authorship and labor. Early on in thinking through the archive of Paul Williams, a question emerged for us. What was to be made of these perhaps decidedly non-spectacular forms of documentation? Rather than somehow apologizing for them or compensating for them through various forms of supplemental mediation, we wanted to ask, how do construction documents sustain and in fact demand new forms of historiographic investigation? And a sketch of a beginning of an answer is what I'll attempt to do today. Paul R. Williams, so the story often goes, was the first Black architect licensed to practice architecture west of the Mississippi in the United States in 1921. In 23, he was the first Black member of the American Institute of Architects, and in 1957, he was inducted as the AIA's first fellow who was Black. And what we look to here on the screen is the type of project that has been typically associated with his early success, namely luxury residential projects constructed for wealthy white clients by the late 1920s, marking in many ways his seeming assimilation into a white-centered notion of successful practice. In the historiographic telling of Williams's life and his work, such claims to precedence are almost without fail accompanied by at least one of two anecdotes, functioning as surrogate to suggest the structural conditions against which Williams's exceptionalism is to be thrown into high relief. As an aspiring architect in turn of the century LA, Williams enrolled in a professional public high school program at Polytechnic High around 1908. It was in his high school years at the school that a new program in architecture was distinguished from the existing program in mechanical drafting. This distinction prompted an oft-repeated episode in Williams's biography. Upon expressing interest in this new architecture program, Williams was confronted by a high school guidance counselor who insisted he remain in the mechanical drafting program, suggesting in no uncertain terms that he would be unable to practice architecture on account of his Blackness. In Williams's own telling, he became resolutely resolved to prove this educator wrong, or rather, as he wrote in a 1937 essay, without having the wish to show them, I developed a fierce desire to show myself. I wanted to vindicate every ability I had. I wanted to acquire new abilities. I wanted to prove that I, as an individual, deserved a place in the world, end quote. Almost invariably, it's a second anecdote which serves as a foundational narrative trope upon which the historiography of Paul R. Williams seems to rely. Williams, it's been often said, developed a particular talent for drawing upside down so as to not make his white clients potentially uncomfortable by having to sit next to them. This off-sided condition functions in a manner analogous to the anecdote of the high school guidance counselor. Both somewhat neatly shed light on the contours of racial prejudice, which Williams no doubt faced, and on his unique combination of exceptional talent and determination, which seemed to have allowed him, the individual, to overcome manifold forms of structural racial inequity, a notion which Williams explicitly invokes in that same essay by way of reference to metaphorical bootstraps. Such narrative strategies often assume and reproduce a conceptual asymmetry. At best, the biographical anecdote reifies the otherwise abstract, racialized barriers to entry to the profession, with anecdotal particularities standing in metonymically for structural and institutionalized wholes. But often, such method yields forms of narrativity whose politics necessitate some degree of suspicion. However, rightful recourse to claims to precedents and to the biographical anecdote seemingly demanded in this historiography has a double effect. Not only are the social continuities that in fact structured Williams' formation obscured, but so too are the structural conditions, the structures of exception themselves, against which Williams, the agent, actively produced himself as exceptional, effectively covered over. So instead, in this talk, this talk will represent an attempt to account for Williams at once as a continuity and as a progenitor, recuperating the biographical as method to account in earnest for both the individual, but importantly so too the structural. Indebted to the foundational work of Wesley Henderson and Karen Hudson in this area, this talk adopts two historiographic postures. A social historical method allows accounting for the social arrangements, the forms of experience, and the modes of learning that shaped Williams in advance of his arrival to primarily white institutions. A comparative method against his white contemporaries, in turn, offers account for how Williams's experience in the nascent formation of architecture as a profession in the specific context of turn-of-the-century LA perhaps necessarily deviated from that of his peers. And at the center of these analyses, we'll find the recurring character of the construction document, something of, well, as we'll see, the dialectical other to the perspectival sketch, as sites for the differential formation of labor and professional identification. And as a kind of aside here, I think it's interesting that we've, whether by chance or otherwise, proceeded in this kind of like reverse chronological way, like almost like an anti-teleological, but we can think about that in a moment. Born in 1894, Williams was raised by his adoptive family and brought up in the First African Methodist Episcopal Church in LA. The oldest Black congregation in the city, LA's first AME had been founded in 1872 by Biddy Mason, who had arrived to LA in 1851 as an enslaved woman and had gained her freedom by petition in court by 1856. Initially operating out of her home on the second floor of the building she had purchased, seen here, the church welcomed into its fold the city's burgeoning African-American population. Waves of migration from the South during the 1880s, including Williams's own birth family, had propelled the city's Black population to exceed 1,200 by 1890. First AME offered a key social center for the newly relocated growing population. Biddy Mason organized a school for Black children, a traveler's aid center, and instilled in those in her circle the value of real estate investment as a mechanism for economic growth, herself having been one of the first Black women to own property in the city. And it's perhaps not an accident that the ground floor of Mason's building in downtown was occupied by an employment office, at least for a time. By the time the congregation relocated to its first dedicated building, a wooden Gothic revival structure in the city's then predominantly Black business district in 1903, the church's social organizing had expanded significantly. The church maintained a reading room stocked with periodicals and books available for study. It maintained its own employment bureau in which the building trades, along with other skilled vocations, were given special emphasis per accounts in the press. Though Williams's particular experience in his early years in the church escapes the archival record, that he was married there in 1917, that he served on its board, and that he designed pro bono its subsequent decidedly modernist home, to which the congregation relocated by 1968, suggests the degree to which he was immersed in this community, which counted among its ranks significant numbers of builders, carpenters, real estate developers, and importantly for this narrative, draftspeople. Williams likely brought in this way a well-defined awareness of building craft and knowledge of longer-standing legacies of Black spatial production to bear upon his subsequent arrival to primarily white pedagogical institutions and professional organizations, and would in turn seek to further these legacies in very particular ways. At the time of Williams's arrival to Polytechnic High, the recently founded public school offered LA's first vocational educational curriculum, eventually including among its offerings an architecture program. Curricular documents here attest, perhaps unsurprisingly, to the program's practical orientation, in which students not only designed, but in fact realized projects. Poly's own art building was designed and executed by its students in architecture, and elsewhere throughout the city, the growing demand for new public educational facilities was to be met by these very same architectural students. Graduating from Polytechnic High in 1912, Williams was one of just a few dozen alumni of the architecture program who went on to become licensed architects before the Second World War. Though Poly's enrollment records highlight the relatively significant numbers of Black, Japanese, and Chinese students at the school during these years, the architecture program was, by large margin, predominantly white. And a comparative analysis of alumni of the program is perhaps illuminating. On one hand, the paths many of these young architects followed toward the profession were strikingly similar. Following graduation, many took jobs as draftspersons and independently offered their services as building designers, joined pre-professional social organizations for aspiring architects, submitted to design competitions, and enrolled in some manner of further academic training. On the other hand, these paths toward professionalization deviated in conspicuous ways, particularly with regard to access to mentorship, the mechanics of publicity, and ultimately to opportunities for career-making commissions. These deviations perhaps reveal, if only obliquely, the differential opportunities available to young Black architects in the period, as well as the particular strategies by which Williams constructed himself as a progenitor. Upon graduation, Williams's professional opportunities were primarily limited to drafting work for prominent area architects, spending the next near decade of his practice employed as a draftsperson. Both Williams's lived experience and architectural contributions he made in these, his very first places of architectural employment, escaped the archival record, but it was the office of John C. Austin which seems to have been particularly pivotal. In Austin's employment, Williams was alternately credited as a, quote, chief draftsman, overseeing some 20-odd draftspeople employed there, and elsewhere as a, quote, designer. Among the major public projects he was credited on was the Shrine Auditorium, for which, following some accounts, he oversaw the production of construction drawings seen here. Whether his contributions extended to design as well is the matter of some degree of debate. Attributing authorship, of course, is no easy task, nor is it perhaps the point. Rather, this suggests how Williams's work through the first decade of his practice necessarily became subsumed into others' authorship. Of course, this wasn't altogether uncommon. Numerous others of Williams's peers at Polytechnic took office jobs, but those who did were often able to reach the profession more quickly than was Williams, and still many others had the means or privilege not to, with classmates enrolling in full-time programs in architecture at UPenn and at USC just after graduation. The fact that these architects in training took rather divergent paths bears underscoring. The earliest guidelines for architectural licensure in California were promulgated in 1901, laying out two possible paths to the profession: successful completion of a two-day examination plus demonstration of a university degree, or an unspecified amount of practical experience was initially sufficient. By the late 19-teens, however, these requirements had been substantially expanded, in part the result of AIA lobbying. Aspiring architects following the latter path, many of whom did not have the means nor access to dedicated periods of university-based study, often had to balance employment against continuing education and ad hoc mentorship opportunities in order to secure both the required knowledge and letters of recommendation. And it was this latter path that was available to Williams. Through the teens and into the early 20s, Williams maintained steady employment as a draftsperson by day. But by night, over weekends, and during summers, in his free time, Williams accumulated extensive architectural training, taking night courses in perspectival sketching, submitting to rendering exercises and competitions, participating in pre-professional social organizations, and executing projects independently as a, quote, building designer, thus amalgamating the experience, knowledge, and social and financial capital necessary to equip him for what he understood to be the domain of architecture proper. Like many of his peers, Williams joined the LA Architectural Club, a key social arrangement for aspiring architects in the period, established the decade previous by a group of draftspeople. Among other activities, the club supported a series of ateliers where architects in training could receive design prompts from established architects in the city, many for and with whom Williams would later work. And it was under the club's aegis that Williams was able to submit designs to national competitions sponsored by the Society of Beaux-Arts Architects. Williams's submissions, made under the patronage of Atelier Los Angeles, were conspicuously distinguished from those of his white former Polytechnic classmate, Joe Weston, who had joined the LA Architectural Club immediately after graduation and had subsequently secured the relatively prestigious patronage of LA architect David C. Allison, and whose entries could thus accordingly be marked under the named Atelier Allison. A select social circle within the LA Architectural Club, Atelier Allison organized banquets, summer classes in engineering, and courses in freehand sketching, and had, perhaps as a result of these activities, an especially high rate of success within national Beaux-Arts competitions. On what account Williams was unable to gain entry into Atelier Allison, to be sure, is unknown. Nevertheless, his relative lack of access to the opportunities afforded there seems to have compelled him to look elsewhere for training. Although Williams made submissions to Society of Beaux-Arts Architects competitions as early as 1916, his first prize win wasn't recorded until sometime around 1923, when he received the $50 Scarab Prize for his sketch design for an artist's studio seen here. Williams' winning esquisse, produced per the exercise's requirements in under 9 hours and without consultation with a patron, was reproduced in pencil points that year. One can perhaps surmise that this later success came at least in part as the result of Williams's intentional effort to supplement his forms of experience and learning with courses at two institutions, the Los Angeles School of Art and Design and USC School of Engineering. While relatively more has been made of the latter courses in engineering that Williams took at USC, relatively scant attention has been given to the Los Angeles School of Art and Design, where Williams would have had available to him for a small fee opportunities to study sketching, freehand drawing, and perspectival rendering, activities that were increasingly seen in the period to be the mark of the proper capital A architect. Taking evening courses in what was described as a Moorish building bordering today's MacArthur Park, Williams participated in a studio-based curriculum directed specifically toward the training of illustrators, cartoonists, and artists, with sketching afforded a foundational pedagogical role as evidenced in the school's prospectus from the period. It was likely here that Williams refined his skill in producing the sort of gestural sketches that later secured him success in prize competitions, elsewhere serving increasingly as the distinguishing mark of the architectural professional, in contradistinction to that of the mechanical and perhaps seemingly mechanized draftsperson. Williams submitted to numerous other design competitions in the period, which not only generated for him rather significant sums of income, but afforded him access to the instruments of publicity, garnering the press attention considered a requisite to forging his professional reputation and client base alike. Differential treatment by the press, however, further suggests discrepancies in the opportunities afforded to these young architects. Initially, Williams's earliest appearances in the architectural press only came by way of his entries into these competitions. Among the earliest was a design for a wooden house, which, although not premiated, appeared in the pages of Architectural Review in 1917. Otherwise, and despite his significant success across these competitions, others of his peers received substantially more opportunities for publicly constructing their architectural persona. The result of a competition for the design of a brick house in 1917, for example, in which former classmate Joe Weston won fourth place prize of $100, afforded Weston the opportunity to set out on a, quote, sketching trip through the missions, quote, with another young white architect in the circle of the LA Architectural Club, Donald Wilkinson. Traveling together in Joe's Ford, the pair produced sketches and photographs for historical sites throughout the state, which were reproduced in a richly illustrated 6-page spread in the San Francisco-based periodical, The Architect. In many ways, this sojourn not unproblematically rehearsed the tropes of the grand tour, both in terms of rhetoric and text, and importantly, representation. Gestural sketches, yet again, yielded a particular form of architectural professional identification. These served, it seems, to craft a profile for these young designers as, quote, gentlemanly architects for an audience of architecture professionals. Williams, by comparison, importantly received analogous treatment in the context of the regional and national Black press. His earliest profile appears in The Crisis, the journal of the NAACP, where in 1917 he was featured as one of 5, quote, men of the month, which cited his success in design competitions, as well as his having exhibited 2 well-received drawings at one of LA's architectural salons, which, to be sure, were credited, quote, only in the name of the firm which employs him, end of quote. Williams was similarly made subject to early write-ups in the California Eagle, Opportunity, and the Southern Workman, among others. Something of a duality then emerges here. Draftsperson by day, architect by night, Williams maintained a double identity for nearly a decade until he finally secured access to the profession proper. And only then, under special sponsorship by his white employer, architect John C. Austin, and notably on a timeline significantly delayed when compared to that of his white classmates at Poly. It was through this amalgamation of experience, this early immersion in cultures of skilled building trades, including drafting, his full-time employment producing construction documents for prominent architects, the informal atelier system, supplemental courses in sketching and rendering, and success in design competitions, that Williams forged his particular path toward licensure. One archive of Williams's work emerges then, construction documents where his direct labor as draftsperson is anonymized. And a second, another archive of construction documents where his hand may have not touched, but where his architectural labor is made explicit. So if the beginnings of Williams's career are typically located in the luxury residential projects he completed for primarily white clients by the early 1930s, this history by comparison draws focus to Williams's early formation in advance of this purported debut. The stakes of this effort are perhaps made clear here in a final project we'll consider, one which predates this chronological frame and suggests the possibilities of this alternative narrativity. Designed by Williams around 1924 and constructed by 1926 for another of the oldest Black congregations in LA, Second Baptist Church, represented one of the earliest major public-facing projects, in fact, credited to Williams. In the project's construction, it was insisted that all skilled workspeople, masons, carpenters, excavators, the people to whom these construction documents were to communicate, were to be hired exclusively from Black-owned firms, suggesting that to account for Williams's exceptionalism and precedence, one must also account for the longer legacies of Black building traditions in which Williams was not only steeped, but in fact directly engaged throughout his career. These narratives aim not to lead to Williams's arrival to architecture by way of his assimilation into white practice alone then, but rather attempt to delineate alternate paths of practice which take seriously the question of how forms of Black spatial production transformed over the first quarter of the 20th century, a history that both precedes and exceeds narrowly defined and often anachronistic notions of architectural practice and professionalization, one which necessitates accounting for social and material histories as much as it does the biographical. These narratives perhaps begin to lay bare the racialized barriers to access to the profession and the status of the Black architectural worker in advance of and in the very earliest years of the practice's formalization in California. And it argues that this analysis must take as its object the construction document, that strange site of technical communication, labor differentiation, and professional formation.
Yes.
Conversation. Can you turn the video on?
Do you want to?
So to introduce the audience to what's happening now, we're bringing back the interlocutors who joined us for this morning's session. We have Irene Sunwoo, we have Elizabeth Misha, and we have Anne-Maria Meister. We wanted to bring you back in. There has been a sort of internal discussion with case studies this morning that this connects to. And so in many ways, I'm sort of hoping that the discussions from this morning around questions of, architectural authorship or even the media of drawing, questions of access and distinctions around, the ways that drawings are either brought into collections or considered to be authored or how authorship is constructed, let's say, that we already began discussing this morning are kind of engaged within this discussion this afternoon. I think my sense of it was that the three very different presentations, but I was really interested if we could begin the discussion by thinking a little bit around the question of access and maybe access and anonymization in a way. It seemed like in all of the three cases, there was the pressure of a form of technical anonymization that everyone was either working against or recognizing the overbearing presence of the possibility that architecture tends to kind of anonymize technical figures in many ways. And even, as we brought up in all three of the presentations, those anonymized figures, the question of anonymization tends to fall along either gender or racial lines in many ways. So thinking about the question of access and the way that we might think about materials as either, well, let's say materials and techniques, Gary, because I think you raised maybe the intersection of those two things, either gaining access or how you might sort of respond to this kind of prompt around access with each of your presentations. And then we'll just open it up for discussion, I guess. But I guess, is there something we could kind of go together? Any thoughts that link us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're in different ways are each working on questions of access and the problem of the inaccessibility of certain kind of forms of labor that we have to describe as anonymous for lack of a better word. One of the things that we've been interested in the Paul Williams project was to count for all the people's initials at the corner, drawn by, traced by, and you'll start to see recurrent initials. The initials might not tell us all that much initially, but maybe there's a kind of effort to credit, thinking about the writing of something like a wall label, to credit the different forms of labor that appear, even if I think on one of the drawings I showed, it just has the initials DZ. Which maybe might be easier to find someone with the last name of Z than it was DC, but still would be a kind of rather difficult task. So how do we account for the anonymized labor, but also offer or afford a sense of humanity to that person whose existence is reduced to just two letters? It's a challenge and a question.
It kind of made me think, Sana, of your project in terms of the practices of putting the body and the labouring body back into the frame, and I guess that might be, I mean, obviously it's very different to speak about architecture, which tends to be, you know, as a subject versus art object, where you can put yourself into the frame in a more embodied way. But there's one sort of connection I was thinking, you were speaking about Xerox and sort of idea that it becomes a device to record yourself in the making of the object, which is a luxury. Maybe it occurs in a slightly different way with Williams. But
I think, yeah, it's very different kind of mode of production, you know, in which even if women artists tended to be, you know, kind of afforded less privileges in terms of recognition in their production, they're free to kind of make their statements about their presence, and they did, you know, and that's what they were doing, right? Not in all cases, but in some cases, you know, kind of presenting a different mode of authorship to the one that they had been signed. In terms, I've been thinking about anonymity a lot because I'm working on a different project on the Guerrilla Girls. So I'm thinking about, you know, the ways in which it's very challenging to tell the story of something if you don't have the identities of the originators, you know, of a given project. And I think it's a really productive situation in many ways, because that kind of mode of authorship is so determining and provides us with opportunities to tell stories in different ways. And I really liked your point where, Craig, where you were talking about the, you know, if you tell the technical histories, you're starting with a different starting, you know, you're not going from biography, you're going from the technical story. And I think because our Xerox project is also a transnational project, it allows us to get over or get away from some of the implications of you know, belatedness or you know, ideas about the periphery doing things later, or even ideas of periphery altogether, because you're telling a history of when a technology landed in a particular place and when and how it became available. So I think for me, thinking about all of these questions is really productive. It has its drawbacks, as you're saying, but about kind of recognizing the labor of people who contribute, but at the same time, it has some advantages to kind of free up other angles for coming into these histories from different vantage points.
Yeah, absolutely. I know. I think that's one of the hardest things to work through and think through in dealing with this kind of material. On the one hand, if one thinks through the technical histories and we sort of decenter it from authors and even sort of human subjects, and we look at the ways in which techniques spread, the way operations are used, the way they're subverted, we have a different possibility for telling stories. But at the same time, by doing that and sidelining the autobiographical, we lose sight of the fact that for someone like Paul Williams, to seize biography, to seize authorship, was the means for recognition.
Absolutely.
And so that tension's a really hard one to square. A tension that would, in fact, insist on biography as being important for thinking about identity. And so it's methodologically, it's very complex, but I think it's rich at the same time.
The question of biography came up in the first session as well, in terms of that sort of the necessity of putting something back within that biographical context in certain cases, and then the question of trying to expand beyond someone's biography in the case where it's tyrannized by, you know, a history of, you know, white male grandmaster. So I think it's that question kind of comes up obviously, and I do appreciate that comparison, like that you want to be able to put technical within the context of the labor on the layers rather than and the fact that it's organized to be invisibilized in the collapse of that by the screen, let's say.
I mean, I think like generationally, a lot of us kind of emerged in this moment where authorship was something to be critiqued in a kind of head-on way. And as you're pointing out, the authors that were being displaced in that historiographic project were white males. And so there was perhaps a kind of politics that made sense in that kind of work. Some of us studied under someone who told us that you never write a monograph again. And for that, I think, kind of set of political reasons. But then there's a question and perhaps like a methodological challenge or opportunity, like how do we extend or do we recuperate the biographical? Do we recuperate the monographical and extend it to subjects who have historically not been afforded that? Well, I don't know if luxury is exactly the right word, but I think there's a kind of challenge to recuperate what might have initially seemed as an old-fashioned, slightly conservative-leaning methodology and update it in some way. I don't know. It's something I struggle with in my dealing with and kind of participating in the logic of a curatorial institution.
Does any of our interlocutors to continue? Yes, Emery. Yeah.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for these talks. It was really, I thought, also a continuation and enrichment of some of the things we talked this morning. I had a comment because we talked this morning also has to do with access, but also with the question of institutional knowledge creation and institutional access, where we talked about how knowledge gets preserved, but also transferred in lateral ways or between institutions, and who gets to write these histories or gets to create that knowledge. And I was thinking, especially in relation to Craig's talk, I'm old enough to have mounted letraset foils myself on a mylar to then go to the copy shop and hope that it wouldn't tear. And in European, that was not in the 50s, just to clarify, but we still did that in the 90s. Yeah. So it was a probe technique. And in European polytechnical schools, often architecture is in the same building or in close vicinity to, let's say, geographers, to cartographers, or to survey studies. So I was wondering, so we would, when we went, not to be anecdotal, but so when we went to the copy shop, we would meet with and we all had the same problem of having large scale drawings that needed to be reproduced. So we would meet the cartographers and the geographers who also had this problem and also mounted things on paper. So I could imagine, or that might be one way to look at how these kind of patterns and mappings and foils as techniques, both in their expression but also in their technicality, moved from one discipline to the other and back, because those and similarly. The stores where we bought our stuff would also supply all these other disciplines. So if they requested a certain material that we didn't know yet, it would be there in the store and we would see it. And then as architects do, like, use or abuse all sorts of things that are in those stores. So but basically I'm saying, or trying to say that maybe in the shared infrastructures that build up around institutions, you get access or exposure to things that then travel between the disciplines in very lateral ways, let's say.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the things that focusing on the material and focusing on techniques allows us to see, are these cross connections between disciplines, but also maybe to ask the question, the kind of cultural techniques question, which is not only how is the technique used, but what symbolic distinctions are being produced out of those techniques. And those symbolic distinctions are ones that mark the dividing lines in our cultures, right? Similar to the fact, I mean, if one were to return to Paul Williams, the example would also be to think through the division of the distinction between different kinds of drawing, orthographic drawing versus perspectival drawing, as being precisely a mechanism of subjectification, yes. Right? Of how a subject can emerge as legible within the field is to assume certain technical practices of perspectival drafting, of sketching, and that the access to those was highly stratified and codified and racialized in gender terms. So to look at the technical histories is not to necessarily put them aside, but to see how they're imbricated in the production of differences and the reproduction of differences socially.
Any other thoughts from our online? In terms of the question of reprographics, then, I mean, as a sort of prompt, maybe Gary, yours was related more to a form of copying that is not, let's say, quite the same way. Logically, I guess maybe it is. I mean, in some ways it is. I guess when you look at the question of access to publicity, for instance. But I wonder if the question of reprographics then plays any role in this formation of authorship. Sort of see that as a connecting piece, and whether it's not really that productive to actually try to find that, to try to think of that as a foundation.
I mean, I think kind of just as a kind of brief, like a quick aside, you know, I was thinking as I was sitting here and listening to both of your talks, I was reflecting, I was like, oh wait, I'm only showing hand-drawn things. And I like, this was not something that I kind of came into this morning having thought. And then I was like, well, there is a continuity of practice, right, and they are being reproduced, and they're being designed in order to be reproduced, but it's happening by hand rather than mediated by a sort of kind of mechanical apparatus. And so on some level, through like, I think the perspective of a cultural technique, I'm like, well, there is something continuous and rather not distinct, although distinct in other ways, I don't know. So, yeah.
I wonder, I mean, just a curiosity question, in the Williams archive, do you see, is there like a reprographic signature where you start to see at a certain time, like the office practice changing and all these emerging in? Absolutely. It'd be interesting to see just like, how does that change the drafting style, the office, what kind of different procedures and people are involved?
Yeah, I mean, so the archive extends until 1980. And so you have, you know, you have blueprints, you have like blackline prints, you have diazos, which our archivist kind of insistently describes as scuzzy. And like, you can't really show them because they're so light sensitive and all these things. And so, yeah, it's really prompted a kind of question of like, what is the historical specificity of these different forms of reproduction, and why in the same historical moment are some projects being produced on kind of, you know, beautiful linen, and in this very same year, something else is being produced on like, I don't know, like a sepia print of some kind. It evades easy accounting for it, but I think it's therefore interesting.
Maybe to bring it back to the first session with the question of the sort of the Xeroxes in Anne-Marie's example, and I'm wondering, in the process of going through the material, has there ever been a discussion around to do with when there's many copies without markings on them? Has there ever been a kind of pressure applied by sort of sheer number of reprographics and a challenge made that they're not, you know, in some way kind of worth storing?
Not in the Williams archive, but this has been a kind of oft-repeated question with regard to the Frank Gehry archive, which is massive in size, and there's a kind of demand on space. And so there's a question, do we keep 6 copies of like construction sets? Like, what if there's just one little annotation? Is that worth keeping, you know, a massive amount of paper for that one annotation? And I can't say that there is a kind of definitive policy that we've developed. It's more on a case-by-case basis, but this, yeah, absolutely is a concern and question.
I'm very interested in like the specificity of architectural reprographic technologies. So, you know, it's really interesting to hear about the presentation focusing on the Xeroxes this morning, because the idea of those Xeroxes, if I got it right, is that they're kind of interstitial and they're like a network of ideas. Whereas, you know, when you're talking about architectural prints and drawings, there's like a specificity, like the large scale nature and specific reproductive techniques. And I am curious if actual, you know, electrophotography or Xerox photocopy, whatever you want to call it, was employed in those, like specifically very in architectural planning, like rather than in like other kinds of accessory material.
Yes, it was, but at a later stage. So I mean, the Xerox phenomenon is so interesting because it seems like you have to think it through both in time and geography, and it varies in time and geography. So the use of xerography that I see in architectural drawings is typically in the 70s and 80s, where you see greater access to those machines, and you can see it included both in perspectives as layered amongst multiple media, transfer media, diazotype, xerography coming to be used at the same time as offices are being able to afford like xerography equipment in the 70s and the 80s. But you also see it in the reproduction of particular details, like a shortcut of like photocopy part of the drawing, cut it out, paste it onto another drawing. So you see it used there, but then that drawing might be diazotyped in Office. And so you would not necessarily know that it was xerography unless you had a sort of fine eye for texture and things like that.
So it's like the ease of, it's kind of, it's a Xerox collage, basically. Like that's how the artists were.
You see it both in sort of self-consciously collage aesthetics, where the graininess of xerography is used to kind of indicate a screen of some type, whether it's a scrim or an actual projection screen or some type of facade treatment, or you see it in a sort of self-concealing way where it's used to reproduce details, a lot like Letra said details, but details that would be specific to the project, and then pasting those into plans.
Or in the correspondence.
Or in the
Right,
correspondence,
so I think
right,
that's one of the interesting things about architecture is that sort of the parallel information that is the communication. So there's some sort of strange idea of many channels of communication that have to happen around the building. And so that's the most common. But then there are these moments where it slips over into the drawings, right? As you're saying, very specific ways. And sometimes it would be like a title block or a schedule or a specification that's kind of text-based.
Right. But then, so you're saying that mostly it would just be, for ease and functional reasons, but it could also be for like an aesthetic reason.
Absolutely, yeah. You see it playing both roles.
And I think just back to Sarah's point about the communication channels, it's also a matter of not a singular audience or not an architect working solely in the office, but thinking through like who they're like the contractor or permitting or the publisher or things. I was really intrigued by your presentation and the moment you commented on Barbara Smith's Xerox machine in her kitchen as a kind of definitive
dining room,
in her dining room. As
she did take food from the kitchen
and her body and the placement of that machine allowing for a different kind of imaging to happen around her body that you can't quite do in a Xerox shop. And it also made me think through some of the things that Sarah was asking in the show, which is like when certain inventories appear in the office and whether it's in the office or whether it's, for example, going to an external. Maybe it's a broader question to you all, if there's a history of inventories in the office, a story of when the Xerox machine shows up in the architecture office versus needing to outsource, or the Xerox machine being a specialized technology versus being a pervasive. I mean, there is a history in the cultural business realm, but specific to the architecture office, curious to all the experts here.
Not that I know, but I think that there's a discussion of printing rooms that sort of tangentially shows up in some of very at least it shows up in the plans, right? And so I think one of the things I was looking at was print room and whether it sat between the administrative department, which it did, and the drawing room, and some of those questions around that, but I have not Xerox, and I think it is that question. Another tangential where I come across it is with this looking into supply stores, and that they often had reprographic bins to them. But yeah,
well, because the story, one thing you also mentioned is this, because thinking through like model histories, and I'm trying to trace the history of the X-Acto knife in architectural work, and you talking about the emergence of the knife, needing a knife now in the office as a kind of conventional tool, whereas I think even in like the early 40s, Sheridan's people had to go to a medical office to buy a surgical knife to make their model, right? So, so that's, I think, just like a great, I mean, your lecture set history is like actually a really great model for how to tell a material story.
Right, yeah, no, it's so interesting that when you begin to just focus on details that would seem to be technical, you very quickly get into details about everyday life and about like sort of social relations and sites and spaces that are actually the revealing bit, you know. And so the question about the knife comes up from the drawing manuals and reproduction manuals of the 70s and 80s, where they say you have to use the sharpest knife you can, because if you tear that letter set, you know, you're going to start all over again. And there's considerable anxiety about just like whether the burnishing is going to actually work, and if it doesn't, then you may have to just redo the whole drawing or erase. And so there's all these little revealing details about this, the everyday life that is involved with the technical.
And raises like questions of knowledge transfer, because these are very haptic forms of knowledge transfer over formalized knowledge that you would find in educational settings in schools, right? Because they're not necessarily, but sorry, just so quickly, they're not necessarily teaching that specificity of procedure in the schools, but then it gets reproduced. And it's curious to know, I mean, a lot of that is person to person, like one person goes from one office to the other and just bring that over.
It's know-how.
Yeah, it's know-how, and
It's funny because I think one of the research was thinking about like this, these materials that are, say, you know, we call them novel, or there's many different types of printing processes, or sort of proliferation of lithotricets and stamp back and all these different techniques of transfers. But when you look at drafting manuals, one of the things I remember noticing was that they would not try to put a lot of this stuff into the drafting manual because it's so quickly updated. And so you actually have to go to the supply catalogs to get a sense of these materials. So I think that was part of it is the question of know-how, how it's about shopping, right? In some really weird way. And then the other thing I'm thinking about, what you're saying about the X-Acto knife and the cutting of the edges, is like the Corbusier is like it's cut with his hand. I mean, like I couldn't, it's not how he cut that is so irregular. It almost looks like he's trying to use the offs pieces. There's something very weird about the way he's
discards, and like maybe a question back to the first session's panelists, which is thinking about like the production of archives and the type of materials that enter into the archive, and this relational aspect to researchers, but also, you know, I think I've always been curious if collecting these types of materials becomes an addendum to the biographical acquisitions that are happening, material supply chains and histories, or other, I mean, they're happening in other archives, obviously, not related to architecture, but I know there's some conversations you guys have been having about different types of things entering in, or even with the Xerox. Did the research group start to broaden the acquisition needs of the GRI to think through acquiring other types of document sets versus the artist's works?
Not so much, and actually most of the works are not in the GRI. It's like they're in other archives and things, but we have, you know, the Barbara T. Smith archive, and then we have various other kind of deposits that it's actually very difficult to excavate, because xerography is not a term that's used that you can search by. So you need to identify authors. Occasionally it will be used, but it's not and so you actually need to identify the authors and check each probable finding aid. You know, if you think there's a chance they could be in there. So it's really like a lot of excavation to do just to see whether there's something there or not. Because first you kind of have to do the secondary research to identify. And when there's not very much published about the artists, that becomes more precarious, right? It's easier to be missing things. And certainly there have been things in our archive that I didn't know the author first, and then I find out about the author, and then I can find the work. But unless I'm able to find out about the author, I can't find the work. So it's really I would say it makes me a little anxious actually that I'm missing things. It feels a precarious way to do research, and because it's under researched. You know. Sorry, I don't think that was your original question, but there's certainly a lot of yeah, like there's kind of, it would be great, for example, to like have the Xerox archives, but they don't seem to be, you know, they're not particularly accessible. And so there's, you know, that whole question of needing to be able to also excavate the technical questions and having difficulty doing that. So I think, you know, whether or not the GRI would be willing to actually acquire an archive like that, it's a different question. But, you know, ideally, we would have access to those things as a, you know, a source for doing the research.
I mean, in our, just to maybe as a brief addition, in our case, in the archive, I mean, there's two aspects we might add to the material question. One is that at least in Germany, the let's say the archives on machines or technological things usually were not kept by the offices, but then are kept by the firms, and they keep their own archives, so they don't mix so much. And one problem or question we also have in our archive is that of restoration. So we have a we are very thinly staffed, let's say, but we have a restorator with a part-time job, but she's a paper restorator because that's so far the biggest part of what needs restoration in our archive. And then if there's models, we try to find specialists who had either worked with the architects together or who know how these models were made. But then, of course, the more materials you bring into the archive, then the question is Mylar with foil still paper? Can she deal with that, or is that something else? And then, so I think that's an interesting question that also then the question of specialized treatment for preservation or documentation comes into play. Because we had, as one, again, story from the archive, we had one estate where it was also about a kind of categorization of knowledge and also a lot of copies, but he invented his own sorting system. He had worked with Frei Otto and some other people, and so we have also his estate, and he had developed this color-coded sorting of categories of structural types. And all of that came in envelopes with the color code on top. And that was before I was in the archive. And then the restorator said, we can't keep them in the envelopes because they're not acid-free, so we need to repack them. So now we have to state that a third of these things is repackaged, restorative, in terms of restoration properly. And they kept, I mean, at least they cut off the top of the envelope, so we still have the color codes, but of course it doesn't function haptically and texturally the same way. And then us as directors or the archivists would say, well, it's more important to preserve the handling and the categorization of the knowledge, and then maybe documents will die sooner, but it's a negotiation. And because we only have the paper restorator and not someone else, like that was the voice of the expert. So that was what was done. And then it was halted at some times, I think, due to budget cuts. But so you see now visually in the shelf, it's like half of it is treated according to the paper restorator, the other half according to the archivist, and we don't really know how to proceed. So it's this kind of limbo of which, what do you want to preserve, which level, and then what kind of experience or expertise in the material do you need to kind of make that decision?
I can add a short comment and then maybe tag Elizabeth to elaborate, but with our permanent collection, we do not take in and also, I believe, do not have tools specifically that are in the collection. Maybe Elizabeth knows of some that are hidden in there. But for, let's say, any new acquisitions, and I haven't encountered this yet, you know, I would ask the question, is this specific to the knowledge related to a particular work of art or architecture? So that's a way of saying we're we're not trying to collect items that reflect the history of the field at large. So that would be kind of the filter for us. But in terms of the archives, I imagine there's lots of weird things in there. So I'll let Elizabeth respond.
Yeah, the only example I was thinking of, Irene, was we seem to have some pairs of calipers in the collection from different architects. But a great example, I think, of this is our Bruce Goff collection, which between our permanent collection, our archives, and the collection at the Price Tower Arts Center in Oklahoma. If you know anything about Bruce Goff, he worked in literally every medium possible, from glass and sequins to pretty much every type of reproductive process in terms of diazo prints and hectographs and copy prints. And it's been really enlightening to go through our collection in the archives as well as the Price Tower Arts Center to see. We have pens that he used. We have, seashells that he traced, and just to understand more about pretty much all the different materials that he was using in all different types of his works. And not only do we have samples from, all the shag carpet ever, but it has really helped us to not only understand his process better, but to, from my perspective and from conservation's perspective, to better care for the works. So we have a lot of restoration to do, and literally tracking down sequins that he used between different decades has been very, very interesting. So we do have a lot of examples like that, but I'd say Bruce Goff is probably our most interesting example of saving materials from firms and just from his through decades and decades of his work.
And that's an example of the very helpful coexistence of the permanent collection and the archives. And I'm glad you brought that example up, because we are doing a big Bruce Goff retrospective in 2025 that's curated by Alison Fisher and Craig Lee. I know they just spent the last week in LA, conveniently when Chicago was in a polar vortex. But in that show, I know that they're planning to show sequins and shag carpet and all of these bits that are part of the process. So I don't know whether or not they've considered pens and those sorts of tools, but I imagine they've been under consideration as the checklist develops.
I just want to mention the time and maybe offer a moment for a final question, if there is one. Or a question from the audience, if maybe the audience questions. Thank you for curating and putting on such a fascinating program. Are there good reference texts you would recommend on the life and career of Paul Williams?
There are a few. I think the foundational text is Wesley Henderson's dissertation, which accounted for Paul Williams as well as Robert Kennard. I think that's been the kind of the basis on which a lot of the scholarship has then developed. There's also Karen Hudson's work. Karen Hudson is the granddaughter of Paul Williams and has developed a kind of series of biographies / autobiographies of Williams in a very interesting way. And then I'll say that our exhibitions, there will be 3 that will open in fall of 26. And if all goes according to plan, the catalog will accompany those 3 exhibitions at the same time. So that might be yet another resource to add to the list.
I suppose a closing, it's not really a question, but one of the things that is so interesting about this discussion has been the question of thinking about, we started with this question of drawing, and Anne-Marie, you were concerned that you weren't going to give us the response you wanted, but it turns out it's exactly what we're hoping to come up with, which is if we start to look at the practices from the making of drawings and the question of how you sort of technical, look at drawings for the materials they're kind of constructed out of, to the handling of them when they're required, to the categorization of them, to the conservation, right? Like the questions kind of breaks down what a drawing is in a really nice way, in a way that I think was our goal in many ways. It was almost like to go for the paper project initiative, project paper series initiative, was a sort of provocation to think about why architecture doesn't neatly fit, right? And so I think that the paper project is about a type of connoisseurship, and what does it mean when you try to think about how to even be a connoisseur with an architectural drawing, which is completely resistant to that form of kind of valuing or even attending to speaking about things. So I think from my point of view, I'm so glad we were able to speak to from the making to the collecting to the conservation, and even how we work against the deeply conservative kind of origins of drawing in many ways to kind of apply our future materials and how architecture is telling in how we want to do that. Yeah, thank you all for joining.
And thank you, and thank you.
Yeah, oh, and also we should also announce the program.
Yes. And if you have not seen the exhibition, this is on view into February 4th. And as a part of the closing weekends program, we've invited the two artists, Julie and Jenna, to present their process of reproducing architectural drawings that we were not enabled to loan, but we wanted to make sure to be in the exhibition. And they did a really fantastic film project and reproduction project. Exhibition copies is the program, February 3rd, next Saturday. And we hope to see you there, or we'll see you at the exhibition. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Maria, thank you.
Mhm.